Let me tell you something I've never quite been able to shake. It happened on a Thursday, ordinary Thursday, the kind where the sky can't make up its mind, not raining, not sunny, just that particular London grey that sits on your shoulders like a damp coat. I was standing near the East Wing service corridor of Buckingham Palace, maybe 40 feet from the children's activity suite that had been set up for the annual charity day. Press credentials around my neck, coffee going cold in my hand. That's how I remember it starting. Just a journalist, just another assignment. I had covered royal events before: the walkabouts, the garden parties, the careful choreography of public monarchy. You learn after enough of them to read the atmosphere. There's a specific texture to a normal royal day. Staff move at a certain pace. Guards hold a certain stillness. The air itself seems organized. That Thursday, none of that was true. I'd arrived at 9:30 in the morning. The charity event, Future Foundations, a program supporting children from underprivileged backgrounds across the Commonwealth, had been planned for months. 230 children between the ages of 5 and 12 were expected. They would have access to dedicated activity rooms in the East Wing, art stations, a storytelling corner, a sensory garden that had been especially prepared on the grounds. The whole day had been framed around giving these children an experience entirely removed from hardship. A day that felt, as one of the program coordinators had told me during the briefing, genuinely magical. King Charles himself had approved the visit. He'd been personally involved in the charity's work for over a decade, long before the crown. His presence at the event had been planned as a highlight, a brief walkthrough of the children's area, a few words, photographs that would travel around the world. Nobody planned for what happened at 11:14 in the morning. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't loud. That's what I keep telling people when they ask. They always expect a dramatic moment, sirens, shouting, someone running. But the first sign was silence. I was near the press pen, maybe 20 yards from the East Wing entrance. There was a small group of us, 4 journalists, 2 photographers, a television crew from a Commonwealth broadcaster. We'd been waiting for the children to arrive. You could hear them before you saw them. That particular sound of a large group of young children, not quite chaos, but close, spilling out of coaches in the inner courtyard. High voices. Laughter with no self-consciousness in it whatsoever. And then a radio crackled somewhere to my left. It was one of the palace security team, plainclothes, earpiece, the kind of stillness that trained people carry in their bodies even when they're trying to look casual. He was maybe 15 feet from me. I wasn't watching him specifically, but I heard the crackle, and then I heard him press his earpiece harder against his canal, and then his entire body changed. Not dramatic, not a sprint, just a tightening, like something internal had rearranged itself. He made one short, quiet call into his sleeve. Within 90 seconds, the East Wing entrance was sealed. Now you have to understand what that entrance looked like that morning. The palace had gone to real effort for this event. There were handmade welcome signs, actual hand-painted ones, done by children at a partner school. Bunting in soft colors strung between temporary posts. A little wooden arch that had been built over the doorway with the words "Welcome, Future Makers" carved into it. Balloons. Not the cheap kind, proper, weighted ones that sat at child height like they were waiting to be grabbed. The 2-foot guards at that entrance, standard ceremonial detail, bearskin hats, scarlet tunics, the works, had been standing their post since 7 that morning. 4 hours in the damp gray cold, still as paintings. When the security team sealed the entrance, those guards didn't move, but something in the way they were standing shifted. I can't explain it better than that. Like a different kind of attention had come online. The children were still in the courtyard. The program coordinators were ushering them into a holding pattern near the coaches, gently, professionally, making it look like a minor schedule adjustment. The children didn't know anything had changed. You could still hear them. Laughter. Someone had found a pigeon. I was trying to get closer when a palace press officer, a young woman named Harriet, who I'd worked with before, who always gave the impression of being professionally serene in the way only extremely stressed people can manage, appeared at my shoulder and said, very quietly, "We're going to need you all to step back to the secondary press area. Just for a few minutes." "What's happening?" "A few minutes," she said again, and walked away. Here is what I pieced together later, through conversations, official statements, and one remarkably candid conversation with a member of the event security team, who shall remain entirely nameless. At 11:09 that morning, a package had been discovered near one of the catering delivery entrances on the palace's south side. The package had triggered an automated threat assessment. I won't go into the specific mechanism, but palace security operates under protocols that are considerably more sophisticated than most people imagine. The threat level assigned was not the highest, but it was high enough. High enough to initiate a partial lockdown of the East Wing. High enough to ground all non-essential movement in or out of the children's activity area. High enough that the decision was made within minutes at a senior security level to prevent anyone, staff, press, event personnel, from entering or exiting that section of the building until a sweep was completed. Anyone. I didn't see King Charles arrive. Nobody in the press pen did. He came through an internal route, the way working royals move through the palace when they're not performing public visibility. But about 40 people saw what happened next, and I've spoken to 8 of them. His Majesty had come down specifically to check on the children. That's not a framing choice, multiple sources confirmed it. He'd been informed of the developing situation, and his response, characteristically, had been to want to be physically present near the children's area. Not for a photograph, not for a statement. He wanted to be there. He arrived at the internal access point to the East Wing Children's Suite at approximately 11:22 a.m. The guard at that access point was a foot guard, ceremonial detail, yes, but every foot guard on a palace internal post is also vetted and trained for exactly this kind of moment. He had been positioned at that door as part of the lockdown protocol. His orders were clear, and they had come from the senior security coordinator on duty. No entry, no exceptions, until the sweep was complete and the all-clear was given. No exceptions. His Majesty approached. The guard did not step aside. I'm going to be careful here, because I'm working from accounts, not direct observation. But what the people who witnessed it describe is consistent enough that I believe it. King Charles, accompanied by 2 personal protection officers, approached the locked internal door. The guard was facing forward in the formal ceremonial position. One of the protection officers, standard protocol, spoke first, announced the king's intent to enter. The guard acknowledged. He did not move. The protection officer spoke again. The guard, and this is the part that the witnesses all remember the same way, responded, verbally, which is in itself unusual. Foot guards on ceremonial duty do not speak. They hold position. They endure. You've seen the tourists. You've seen what they put these men and women through trying to crack them. They do not speak. This guard spoke. He said, and I'm paraphrasing from accounts, that he had received orders from the duty security coordinator, that the wing was under active protocol, that he was unable to permit entry to any person until the all-clear was issued, that this included all personnel. He said it formally, correctly, with complete respect and with no room whatsoever. The protection officers conferred. One of them made a call. King Charles waited. Multiple witnesses say he didn't argue, didn't push, just stood there, waiting in that particular way he has of occupying patience, like it's a thing he's been practicing his entire life, which of course he has. The sweep took 11 more minutes. At 11:38 the all-clear was issued. The guard stepped aside. His Majesty entered the children's area. I didn't see the king with the children directly. We were still in the secondary press area. And by the time access was restored, The official program was resuming carefully, and the media access was being managed with a fairly tight hand given the circumstances. But I saw the children coming out at the end of the afternoon, and I'm going to tell you something about that, because it matters to the story. These were children from housing estates in Birmingham, from rural areas of Jamaica and Ghana, from struggling postcodes in Glasgow and Cardiff. They'd been given a day that most of them would remember for the rest of their lives. And yes, there had been a scare. Yes, the schedule had been disrupted. Yes, there had been 45 minutes of quiet anxiety that the adults had worked very hard to keep entirely invisible to the children. And the children had found a pigeon, and drawn pictures, and eaten the fancy biscuits, and laughed at something one of the program staff had done with a balloon animal. They came out of those doors in the late afternoon with paint on their hands and sugar on their faces, and the kind of noise that means a day has been genuinely, completely good. The guard was still at his post when I walked past on my way out. The bearskin hat, the scarlet tunic, the stillness that those men and women carry like a second spine. I stopped, I'm not entirely sure why. Professional habit maybe, or something else. He wasn't looking at me. He wasn't looking at anything, really, in the way that suggests they're looking at everything. I thought about what it must take to stand in front of a king, to have every piece of ceremony and tradition and 1,000 years of hierarchical instinct pulling in one direction, and to hold your position, not because you don't know who he is, because you know exactly who he is, and you know what your orders are, and you know that an order which makes exceptions isn't an order at all. I thought about what it means to serve something bigger than the person standing in front of you. There's a word for that. I'm not sure we use it enough. I walked to the gate. The London grey had finally made up its mind and turned to a soft, thin rain, the kind that takes a while to realize you're getting wet in. I flagged a cab. The whole way back, I kept thinking about that door. And the man who didn't open it. The thing that stayed with me wasn't the drama of it. People hear a story like that, a guard stopping a king at a door, and they imagine confrontation, raised voices, some kind of standoff with tension crackling in the air. That's not what happened. What happened was quieter than that, and honestly, a lot more unsettling, because quiet things that should be loud have a way of sitting in you longer. I went back to my editor that evening with my notes, and she looked at me across her desk and said, "That's a good anecdote." I said, "I think it's more than an anecdote." She said, "Write it like it is then." So that's what I'm doing. Let me tell you about the guard. Not his name, I don't have it, and I'm not going to speculate. But I know some things about what it means to be a foot guard at a palace internal post on a day when something has gone wrong, and I want to be precise about this, because precision is what the story deserves. The household division, the regiments that provide the iconic ceremonial soldiers you see at the palace and horse guards, operates on a principle that is almost deliberately paradoxical to civilian logic. The ceremonial function is real. The stillness, the uniform, the tradition, it's not theater for tourists, even though tourists treat it as such. It is a genuinely performed continuity of institution. These guards are embodying something. They are, in a literal and practiced sense, the physical manifestation of a constitutional idea. But the operational function is equally real. These are not actors in costume. They are trained soldiers. They hold security clearances. They operate under command structures that do not pause for ceremony when circumstances demand otherwise. And one of the things that structure demands, one of the things built into the protocol at a fundamental level, is that an order from a security coordinator during an active incident supersedes everything else. Everything, including the instinct to defer to a king. That instinct, by the way, is not nothing. I want to be honest about that. We live in a largely post-deference age, and it's easy to talk about rules and protocols as though following them is effortless, obvious, uncomplicated. But standing in front of the King of England, a man who, whatever your politics, carries the weight of living constitutional history in his person, and holding a door closed against him requires something. It requires a specific kind of clarity, a certainty about what you serve that is stronger than the social pressure of the moment. That's not small. I started making calls the day after the event. Not immediately. I had a piece to file, and the official palace statement on the day had been spare and careful, acknowledging a minor security precaution that had briefly adjusted the program schedule without elaborating further, which was accurate technically and told you almost nothing. I spoke to 3 people who had been inside the palace that morning in various capacities. I spoke to 2 journalists who had been in the press area with me. I spoke to a former member of the Household Division, retired now, 15 years out, who agreed to talk to me generally about protocol and culture, not about the specific incident. And I spoke briefly to one of the program coordinators for future foundations, a woman who had spent the better part of 6 months organizing this day, and who, when I reached her by phone, sounded like someone who had recently been through something and was still deciding how she felt about it. "Can I ask you about the security interruption?" I said. There was a pause, a considered one. "The children didn't know," she said. "That's the main thing. The main thing is that they didn't know." "How did you manage that?" "We kept moving. We pivoted to the indoor art station earlier than planned. They were extraordinary. Nobody panicked. Everyone just quietly did the next thing." "And when you heard what had happened at the internal access point, with the king?" Another pause. "I heard about it afterward," she said, "and I thought, yes, obviously that's what you do." She stopped. "Though I also thought, God, can you imagine, standing there and saying no to that, just standing there?" I said I could imagine it. I wasn't sure I could. The package, it turned out, was not a bomb. The official assessment, released in a low-key security bulletin 3 days after the event, described it as a suspicious item that upon examination presented no credible threat, which is the language of official statements, meaning something that looked alarming enough to trigger protocol and turned out to be something mundane and probably coincidental. What specifically it was, I haven't been able to confirm. The people who know aren't talking, and I'm not going to speculate in print about the details of a palace security incident. What matters for this story is that, in the moment, in those 26 minutes between the initial alert and the all clear, nobody knew that. In the moment, the protocol existed because the alternative to protocol is a world where someone in that building makes a judgment call about whether a threat is real, and judgment calls in that situation cost lives. The protocol is the answer to that problem. The guard who held the door was the protocol. I want to talk about King Charles for a moment, specifically about how he behaved in those 11 minutes he stood on the wrong side of that door. This is based on witness accounts, and I'll say up front that witness accounts of royal behavior carry a particular kind of unreliability. People tend to project onto monarchs to see what they expect or want to see, but the accounts I have are consistent, and they don't describe anything that requires projection. He waited quietly. He didn't push. He didn't use the weight of his position to push. He didn't invoke authority. He stood with his protection officers in a palace corridor while a guard held a door shut and his people made calls and the clock moved forward. One of the witnesses, a member of the catering staff who was in the corridor for reasons unrelated to the event, described him as looking patient. She said it in a way that suggested she found this surprising, and then corrected herself and said, "Not impatient, I mean. He just waited." There's something in that. I'm not writing a hagiography here. I'm a journalist, and I try to stay on the right side of the line between observation and sentiment. But I think there's something genuinely worth noting in the fact that a man accustomed to 1,000 small deferences, doors opening, rooms quieting, people stepping back, stood at a door and let the door stay closed. He let the protocol be what it was designed to be, which is bigger than any individual on either side of it. That's not nothing either. The former household division member I spoke to, I'll call him W, because he asked me to be careful, talked for about 40 minutes about what he called the weight of the ordinary moment. People think the big dramatic things are the test, he said. They're not. The drama, you're ready for the drama. You've trained for the drama. The drama has adrenaline in it, and adrenaline makes decisions easier. It's the ordinary moment that finds you out. The moment when every instinct and every social cue says one thing and the order says another. And which wins? I asked. The order wins, he said. If you've been trained properly, the order wins, because you understand what the order is for. It's not there to be inconvenient. It's not there to prove a point. It's there because someone thought very carefully about what happens when it doesn't exist. He paused. Then he said, "The best guards I ever served with didn't find it hard, not because they had no feeling about it, but because the feeling and the order weren't in conflict for them. They understood what they were protecting was bigger than who was on the other side of the door." I wrote that down. I looked at it for a long time. There's a thing that happens at these events, big royal charity days, state occasions, anything that pulls a lot of logistics and a lot of people together, where you see the machinery of institution very clearly. Not because it breaks down, usually because it doesn't. The children didn't know there had been a scare. The program ran. The art stations were visited. The storytelling corner was by all accounts a particular hit, with a storyteller who had apparently been doing this for years and who could hold 40 children absolutely still for 20 minutes with nothing but her voice and a picture book. The sensory garden got slightly delayed but opened in the afternoon, and the program coordinator told me that several children simply sat in it, quietly, as if the garden itself was a thing they needed. The king walked through the children's area. He stayed longer than scheduled. He sat on a low chair in the storytelling corner. And yes, I've seen the photograph that circulated afterward, the one where he's clearly listening, genuinely listening in the way that people do when they've chosen to be fully present somewhere. And he talked to children whose names he would probably not be able to recall the next morning, because there were 200 of them and he is 80 years old, and this is not a failing. This is just being human. The day was, by all measurable accounts, a success. The suspicious package was taken away and assessed and determined to be nothing. The children went home on coaches with paint on their hands. The guard finished his shift. I filed my piece 2 days after the event. My editor called it restrained. She meant it as a compliment, I think. I wrote about the protocol. I wrote about the guard carefully, without identifying details, with the appropriate qualifications about working from witness accounts. I wrote about the children and the program and the coordinator who kept everything moving. I wrote a short paragraph about His Majesty's behavior in the corridor that I sweated over for about an hour, trying to be precise without being either reverential or diminishing. The piece ran. It got a reasonable response. A few people reached out, former military mostly, to say they recognized what I was describing. A few people reached out to say they hadn't considered it from that angle before. One person, I don't know who, the message came through the general editorial inbox, wrote just 3 words. He did right. No signature, no context, just that. I've thought about those 3 words more than I've thought about most of the longer, more articulate responses. I want to end this section with something that happened at the very end of the day, after the children had left and the press were being cleared out, and the palace was settling back into its ordinary, extraordinary self. I was walking toward the exit, the press credential around my neck, my recorder in my bag, my coffee long since gone cold and abandoned somewhere, when I passed the East Wing entrance again. The welcome arch was still there. The bunting. The balloons had drifted but not gone. The wooden sign, "Welcome, Future Makers." The foot guards had been rotated, so the ones at the door now weren't the ones from the morning, But the post was the same. The position was the same. The stillness was the same. I thought about what had happened at the internal access point. I thought about the guard who had spoken, who had said, formally and correctly and with no space for argument, that he could not permit entry. I thought about the fact that nobody outside the palace, or very nearly nobody, would ever know his name, that he would never receive a commendation for that moment because it would be too awkward to commend someone for holding a door against a king, even when holding it was exactly right, that he had done a thing that required genuine moral and professional clarity, and then gone home at the end of his shift and probably eaten something ordinary for dinner and maybe watched television. The palace doesn't reward the ordinary extraordinary. It depends on it. And something about that, the depending on it, the fact that it works precisely because it is never dramatic, never noticed, never turned into a story, something about that made me stop walking for a moment. Just a moment. Then I went through the gate. The rain had stopped. The evening sky over London was doing something complicated and pink that I didn't have a word for. I thought, some people hold things together without ever letting you see the effort. I thought, that is a very specific kind of courage. I went home and wrote it down. 6 weeks after that Thursday, I went back to Buckingham Palace. Not on assignment. I want to be clear about that because it matters. There's a difference between returning somewhere for professional reasons and returning because something in you hasn't finished with it yet. I told myself I was going for a walk. I live in Pimlico and the route to Green Park goes near the palace, and it was a Saturday and the weather had finally, after weeks of relentless London grayness, done something decent. Pale blue sky. The kind of October light that sits at a low angle and makes everything look like it's been thought about. I had my hands in my pockets and no recorder and nothing to file. I stood at the gate for maybe 10 minutes. The tourists were there, of course. Always the tourists. There's a particular ritual that happens near the foot guards on public-facing posts, people approaching, phones extended, trying to get close enough for a photograph that makes the guard look like a prop in their holiday. Some of them actually touch the guards. Some of them make faces, hopping for a reaction. Some of them, the younger ones especially, just stare with an expression I can only describe as genuine bewilderment, like they genuinely cannot parse the stillness, like it breaks something in their understanding of how people are supposed to work. The guard stood, that was all, just stood. And I thought, here we go again. Here's the thing I keep coming back to. After my piece ran, I had a conversation with a colleague of mine, a photographer who had been working royal events longer than I had, who'd covered everything from state funerals to garden parties, who had the particular slightly detached quality that comes from years of watching very significant things happen through a lens. We were at a press lunch. Someone brought up my piece. The thing I keep thinking about, I said, is that nobody outside the palace will ever really know that it happened. The guard doesn't get a story. He doesn't get a record. He just did his job and went home. My colleague looked at me over his glass for a moment. Then he said, "That's what the job is." I know, but doesn't that? You think it bothers him? I thought about it, I don't know. I've photographed those guards for 15 years, he said. And the ones who last, the ones who are genuinely good at it, they're not looking for recognition. They're not even thinking about recognition. They're thinking about the next thing, the next moment, whether the post is held correctly, whether the door is secured. He set his glass down. The recognition would almost ruin it. Because the moment you start thinking about being seen doing the right thing, you're doing something slightly different from the right thing. I didn't have an answer to that. I still don't entirely. But I think he's right. I've been a journalist for 11 years. I've covered politics, crime, international affairs, and a fair bit of human interest, which is a category so broad it basically means everything that matters and some things that don't. I've sat across from people who did remarkable things and interviewed them and written about them and moved on to the next story. This one stayed with me differently, and I've spent some time trying to understand why. Part of it is the inversion. A guard stopping a king is an upside-down image of the expected order of things. And inversions, when they're not cheap or comic, when they happen for real and serious reasons, tend to carry meaning. They illuminate something about the structure they're inverting. Part of it is the children. 230 children who had a good day in a place that is built almost entirely for the performance of governance and tradition, a place that doesn't really belong to childhood in any conventional sense. The sensory garden, the paint on their hands, the storyteller who could hold them still for 20 minutes, those details sadden me too. But the main thing, if I'm being honest, is the guard at the door. Not because he's a hero. I want to be careful about that word. Hero is too large and too loose, and it gets applied to too many things that don't quite fit. What he did was not heroic in the dramatic sense. Nobody was in physical danger from a door being opened at the wrong moment. The danger, such as it was structural, procedural. An order made meaningless by an exception. A protocol undone by the social pressure of a moment. He prevented that, quietly, correctly, without making it into anything more than what it was. That's a different word. I'm looking for the right one. Maybe it's integrity. Maybe it's just steadiness. The kind of steadiness that isn't dramatic to watch because it doesn't waver, and things that don't waver don't have the visual narrative of things that do. But steadiness, maintained consistently, over time, in moments no one is recording, that's what holds things together. That's what the whole structure depends on. About a month after the event, I received an email through my work address. It was from a woman who identified herself as the mother of one of the children who had attended the Future Foundation's event. She'd seen my piece, shared to her by a friend, and she wanted to tell me something. Her daughter, she said, was 9 years old, had never been to London before, had talked about the day for weeks afterward, with a specificity and a delight that her mother described as the kind of thing you tuck away because you know it matters. She told me what her daughter remembered. The biscuits, the colors in the sensory garden, a guard at the door who had been very tall and very still and who her daughter had decided, with complete 9-year-old certainty, was definitely a statue that had learned to breathe. She told her mother this on the coach home, apparently with total seriousness. And her mother had almost corrected her, and then hadn't, because sometimes the explanation a child lands on is better than the accurate one, and also because, what do you say? He's a real person, a trained soldier, a professional holding a post during an active security incident. Not to a 9-year-old on a coach going home from the best day she's had in recent memory. Let her have the statue that learned to breathe. I read that email 3 times. I saved it in a folder I keep for things I don't want to lose. There's a version of this story that writes itself easily. The version where it's all about hierarchy and the dramatic reversal of it, the common soldier who stopped the king, the clear-cut moral about duty over deference. You can wrap that up neatly. It has a satisfying shape. I don't think it's the right version. The right version, I think, is messier and more interesting. It's about a system that was designed, by people thinking carefully about failure modes, to be bigger than any individual inside it. It's about a guard who understood what he was part of well enough to hold his position in a moment when holding it was genuinely difficult. It's about a king who understood the same thing well enough to wait. And it's about 230 children who had a good day because the system held, and because the program staff pivoted smoothly, and because nobody let the machinery show. Systems get a bad name. We talk about them as though they're the opposite of humanity, cold, procedural, unfeeling. But a good system is a human achievement. It's the stored intelligence of people who thought about what could go wrong and built a structure to prevent it. It carries collective wisdom forward in time. It works on days when individuals might fail. The guard didn't hold that door because he was inhuman. He held it because he was part of something larger than himself, and he knew what that meant. That's not cold. That's actually a very specific kind of warmth. The warmth of someone who has understood that their responsibility extends beyond their own comfort, their own instinct, their own momentary social calculus. I want to tell you about the last thing I saw before I left the palace on that Saturday afternoon. I'd been standing at the gate for maybe 10 minutes, watching the tourists do their thing with the guard, when a small girl, she was maybe 5, maybe 6, wearing a red coat that was slightly too large for her and carrying a stuffed rabbit with considerable authority, broke away from the adults she was with and walked, very deliberately, toward the guard. She stopped about 3 feet from him, looked up at him. He was tall, as they all are, and in full ceremonial dress, and she was at about the height of his knee. She considered him for a very long time. Then she did something I have thought about frequently since. She held the stuffed rabbit up at arm's length toward him, an offering or a greeting or some 5-year-old logic entirely her own. He didn't move. He couldn't move. He was on post, the bearskin, the scarlet tunic, the absolute stillness. But I was watching his eyes. You can watch eyes without seeing other movement. And something in them, I can't claim anything dramatic, I can't claim certainty, but something in them shifted. A quality of attention, the tiniest thing. The girl held her rabbit up for another moment. Then she lowered it, satisfied with whatever answer she'd received, and turned and went back to the adults. The guard held his position. I don't know his name. I don't know what he thought about that morning, 6 weeks earlier, when he'd held a door against a king. I don't know if he went home and told someone. I don't know if he thought about it at all. What I know is that he was there, that he did his job, that when it mattered in a way that mattered and that required genuine clarity, he held his position. And then he kept holding it, day after day, in the cold and the gray, while tourists pointed cameras at him and children held stuffed rabbits up in greeting. And I know that somewhere on a coach going back to Birmingham, there's a 9-year-old who believes he's a statue that learned to breathe. Maybe she's not entirely wrong. I walked home through Green Park. The October light was doing its low-angle thing, and the leaves were mostly gone from the trees, just the ones that clung past their time, brown-edged and stubborn. A man was walking 2 dogs. A couple were sitting on a bench sharing food from a paper bag. Somewhere behind me, the palace was being the palace. I thought about systems. I thought about the people inside them who make them work. I thought about a door held closed in a corridor, and the patience of a man waiting on the wrong side of it, and 230 children who had paint on their hands and didn't know that any of it had happened. I thought, most of the things that hold together do so because of people we'll never hear about. People who made the ordinary decision to do the correct thing in a moment that wasn't dramatic and wasn't watched and wouldn't be recorded. People who understood that the work is not the recognition of the work. It's just the work. The leaves held on. The dogs went past. The light went low and quiet over the park. I kept walking. Some things you carry forward without quite being able to put them down. This is one of mine. The guard at the door. The door that didn't open. The children who never knew.